What I'm about to share with you isn't just a story, it's a record. A strange, unsettling piece of American history buried so deep that even the most curious historians hesitate to mention it. The year was 1856. The place, a quiet farming community in southern Ohio, surrounded by endless fields of corn, dirt roads, and a silence only broken by the creak of wagon wheels or the distant ringing of a church bell. Life here was simple, predictable, until the night the triplets were born. No one in the town had ever seen three children arrive together. At first, it was celebrated as a miracle, but almost immediately, whispers began to spread. The midwife swore the lanterns flickered out the moment. The first child took his breath. The second was born with his eyes open, staring, unblinking, as if he had already seen too much of this world. And the third did not cry. He simply watched the room, silent, until he finally exhaled. From that night forward, the town would never be the same, because nothing about these children was ordinary. Southern Ohio in 1856 was a place caught between two worlds. On the surface, it was just another quiet farming community, the kind where Sundays belonged to church, winters belonged to the hearth, and every neighbor knew not only your name, but the names of your grandparents. But beneath that peaceful surface ran an undercurrent of tension. This was the edge of the Underground Railroad, where secret passages, false barns, and hidden cellars smuggled desperate souls toward freedom. Farmers plowed their fields by day and, by night, whispered codes to strangers in the dark. Suspicion hung thick in the air, because not everyone agreed on what was right or wrong. Some believed in liberation, others believed in bounty hunting. It was in this strange and divided landscape that the triplets came into the world. At first, their presence was only another rumor, the kind that swirls in a small town. But people began to notice things. Cows went missing, and somehow one of the boys always knew where they had wandered. A child vanished into the woods, and the triplets, barely old enough to speak, led a group of farmers directly to her hiding place. The townsfolk didn't call it power. They called it unnatural knowing. Some said it was a gift from God, others a curse whispered straight from the devil. And in a community already divided by politics, morality, and fear, the triplets became a line in the sand, those who protected them and those who wanted them gone. By the time the triplets turned 5, the town could no longer deny that something was different. Children at that age should stumble, fall, and cry. These boys didn't. They moved with an uncanny sense of awareness, as if they knew where every root, every stone, every shadow would be before they stepped upon it. The first real incident happened on a rain-slick afternoon. A horse broke loose from its reins and thundered down Main Street, hooves pounding, wagon still attached, the townsfolk scattered in terror. But the triplets didn't run. One of them stepped into the road, raised a small hand, and the horse stopped, dead in its tracks, like it had been yanked by an invisible force. The crowd swore they hadn't seen reins, no rope, no trick, just a boy's hand and an animal frozen mid-charge. After that, the incidents multiplied. Lost objects were found with disturbing accuracy. A mother's wedding ring misplaced in the dirt? One of the triplets walked straight to it, without hesitation. A hunting dog gone missing for 3 days? Another child pointed to the exact grove where it lay, weak but alive. The most haunting event came during a Sunday sermon. The congregation sat in silence as the preacher thundered about fire and brimstone. One of the boys, barely tall enough to peer over the pew, spoke a single sentence, clear and cold. "He is lying." Moments later, the preacher collapsed at the pulpit. A stroke, the doctor said. But the timing was unsettling. Whispers turned into fear. Some neighbors crossed the street to avoid the family, others locked their doors at night. And a few, more desperate than the rest, began asking the boys for help, for guidance, for answers to questions no child should ever be asked. The triplets were no longer just children. They were an enigma, and that made them dangerous. By 1856, superstition and science walked hand in hand, often colliding in small American towns. The triplets became the perfect battlefield for that collision. Local doctors were the first to intervene. Dr. Amos Fletcher, a stern man trained in Cincinnati, rode 20 miles by horse to examine the boys. He pricked their fingers, checked their eyes, listened to their heartbeats. His conclusion? They are healthy, too healthy. He confessed privately that he had never seen children with such sharp reflexes, such unblinking composure. But instead of settling fears, his words only deepened them. The clergy, however, saw things differently. Reverend Isaac Cole declared from the pulpit that the triplets were harbingers of sin, their powers unnatural, their silence during prayer a sign of blasphemy. Yet not all agreed. A smaller, quieter faction within the church whispered that perhaps they were chosen, vessels of divine purpose sent in a time of turmoil. The town split down the middle. Farmers who had once shared bread at the same table now turned their backs on one another. Mothers tugged their children away if a triplet passed too close. And yet, in the dead of night, those same fearful neighbors sometimes knocked softly at the family's door. A sick child, a missing calf, a husband who had not returned from the mines. Desperation outweighed fear. And more often than not, the boys answered with frightening accuracy. One story told of a grieving widow who begged the triplets to tell her where her husband had gone. He had vanished weeks earlier on a river journey. The boys did not speak, but the youngest drew in the dirt with his finger. A crooked shape, a winding line, ending in an X. Days later, the man's body was found tangled in driftwood at that exact bend in the Ohio River. Coincidence, some said. Proof, others argued, but science could not explain it. Faith could not contain it. And as whispers spread beyond the village, strangers began to arrive, men who claimed to be scholars, spiritualists, even government men, each determined to study the triplets. None of them would leave without questions. And a few would not leave at all. For a while, the town learned to live with its fear. The triplets had become shadows that lingered at the edge of every story, names spoken only in hushed tones. But then the accidents began. And after that, no one called them miracles anymore. The first tragedy came in the summer of 1861. A barn caught fire in the middle of the night, flames rising like a beacon against the cornfields. Neighbors rushed with buckets of water, but by the time they arrived, the barn was nothing but embers. Inside lay the bodies of 2 horses, both belonging to a man who had publicly accused the triplets' mother of harboring demons. The next morning, people swore they had seen the boys standing at the edge of the field, their faces blank, watching the fire without moving. Then came the disappearance of Sarah Whitmore, a girl no older than 8. She had been playing near the riverbank when she vanished without a sound. Search parties combed the area for days, nothing, until the oldest triplet pointed to the water and whispered, "She is beneath." When the men pulled Sarah's body from the river, her eyes were open, wide in terror, as though she had seen something unspeakable. The townsfolk began connecting dots. Every calamity seemed to orbit the boys. A cow struck dead by lightning the day after its owner mocked them. A fever that swept through a family who had tried to drive them from the church. The chilling regularity of it all forced a question no one dared speak aloud. Were the triplets merely predicting these events, or were they causing them? Fear hardened into anger. Neighbors who once sought their help now bolted their doors at night. Some carried crosses, others knives, as if steel or scripture could guard against whatever force these children carried. Yet the strange thing was, the triplets never fought back. They never protested their innocence. They simply watched, calm, unreadable, like judges weighing a verdict only they could see. The most unsettling event came one autumn evening. During a town meeting, voices rose in heated argument over whether the family should be forced to leave Ohio altogether. In the middle of the shouting, the youngest triplet turned to his mother and whispered, "He will fall." Seconds later, one of the loudest men, Ezekiel Carter, collapsed, clutching his chest. He was dead before he hit the ground. That night, the triplets' home was surrounded by torchlight. Farmers and townsfolk gathered, not to pray, but to act. Yet something strange happened. One by one, their lanterns sputtered out until the mob stood in darkness, unnerved and silent. When the flames returned, the boys were gone, vanished. Some believed the family fled under cover of night. Others swore the triplets had simply dissolved into the air. But one fact remained. From that moment on, tragedy clung to Cedar Mills like a curse, and the triplets were never seen again. When the triplets vanished, silence fell over Cedar Mills like a funeral shroud. For weeks, no one dared speak their names aloud. It was as though the town had convinced itself that forgetting them would undo the terror. But forgetting was impossible. Too many graves, too many whispers, too many unanswered questions. Sheriff Elias Moore organized searches across the fields, rivers, and wooded hills. Bloodhounds traced the boys' scent to the edge of the Blackwood forest, only to stop abruptly, whining and refusing to go farther. "It's as if the trail ends in nothing," the sheriff admitted. "No footprints, no torn clothing, no sign of struggle, just absence." That absence, however, did not go unnoticed beyond the borders of Ohio. Within months, strangers began to arrive. Some came in plain clothes, others in official uniforms. They claimed to be government men, scholars, physicians from New York and Philadelphia. They asked questions no one wanted to answer. What had the boys done? What had they said? What had they left behind? Families who refused to cooperate often found themselves harassed, their farms raided under the pretense of investigation. Few of the visitors never left at all. Dr. Henry Kessler, a physician from Boston, was last seen entering the Blackwood forest with a notebook and lantern. Days later, searchers found his lantern extinguished on the forest floor, but no trace of the doctor himself. Others reported hearing faint voices in the woods, children's voices calling their names, and refused to go back. Meanwhile, the town itself changed. Crops failed mysteriously. Tools broke more often than they should. A pall seemed to hang over every household. Ministers preached harder, warning of divine judgment. Doctors whispered privately about psychic phenomena. The two sides, faith and science, clashed more violently than ever before. And through it all, one thing remained certain. No explanation satisfied anyone. Years passed, but the legend of the triplets grew. Mothers warned their children not to wander near the river, lest the knowing boys call them under. Hunters avoided the forest, and travelers who passed through Cedar Mills often remarked on the silence of its people, as though an invisible hand had pressed the town's throat shut. By 1870, the government had reportedly sealed away files on the case. Locals spoke of strange men returning at night to dig near the old family homestead. Some swore they carried crates marked with federal stamps. Others claimed the earth itself seemed to resist being disturbed there, as if roots or stone pushed tools back toward the surface. But perhaps the most haunting evidence came from diaries left behind by those who lived closest to the family. Pages spoke of dreams of 3 children standing at the foot of their beds, staring silently. Dreams so vivid that some woke with muddy footprints on the floorboards. To outsiders, it was folklore. To the people of Cedar Mills, it was truth. The triplets may have disappeared, but their presence lingered like smoke that refused to fade. Some nights, if the wind howled across the Ohio River just right, townsfolk swore they could hear laughter, thin, childlike, and terribly close, and in that laughter was a promise. They were not gone. Not really. By 1872, the story of the vanished triplets had traveled far beyond Ohio. Newspapers in Cincinnati and New York printed lurid headlines: "Children of Prophecy," "Satan's Brood of Cedar Mills," "Oh, Case that Science Refuses." Each article drew more curiosity seekers, more men with notebooks and lanterns, more women who whispered of seances and the thin veil between worlds. The people of Cedar Mills wanted nothing more than to bury the past, but the outside world refused to let them. Spiritualists arrived first. They rented rooms in the inn and held candlelit gatherings, claiming the voices of the triplets could be reached through the proper incantations. One such session ended with a woman screaming in convulsions, shouting in 3 overlapping voices, each speaking a different phrase at once. Witnesses swore one of the voices was a perfect imitation of young Samuel Richter, the oldest triplet. The woman fled town the next morning and never returned. Then came the journalists. Some sought truth, others spectacle. One man from the New York Herald staged a mock expedition into the Blackwood Forest, promising to uncover the children's remains. His team never went more than half a mile in before turning pale and abandoning their venture. They reported, hearing the rustling of footsteps behind them, though no figure was ever seen. That night, the journalist's notes were found scattered in the mud outside his lodging, pages soaked and words unreadable. The greatest tragedy, however, came not from outsiders, but from within. On a cold October evening, the townspeople gathered for a harvest celebration in the square. For a brief moment, laughter returned to Cedar Mills. Lanterns swung from beams, music played, cider was poured. But as midnight neared, the air shifted. Witnesses described it as a sudden stillness, the kind one feels before a storm. The fiddler's bow snapped mid-song, plunging the square into silence, and then the church bell began to toll. No one was inside the chapel. No one touched the rope. Yet the bell rang 12 times, shaking the rafters. On the 12th strike, the square erupted in screams. Flames burst from 3 separate torches, leaping unnaturally high, searing the wooden stalls. Amid the chaos, a child cried out, young Ruth Carter, only 6 years old, before vanishing in the crowd. Her parents searched frantically, but Ruth was gone. No one saw her leave. No one saw her taken. She was simply there one moment, and gone the next. The following morning, her shoes were found at the edge of the river. Wet. Empty. That night, many families packed their belongings and left Cedar Mills for good. Those who stayed spoke less and prayed more. And in every whispered prayer was the same unspoken plea that the triplets, whatever they were, wherever they had gone, would not come back. But deep down, everyone knew. They already had. By 1874, the legend of the triplets had grown so large that whispers reached the highest halls of government. Washington men in dark coats began arriving at odd hours, slipping into the sheriff's office with sealed crates and walking out with boxes of confiscated diaries, maps, and even church records. Their presence was no longer a rumor. It was fact. People of Cedar Mills called them the collectors. They asked no permission. They offered no explanations. They simply took. One farmer, Ezekiel Barnes, followed the strangers one night as they carried lanterns into the Blackwood Forest. He claimed they reached a clearing he had never seen before, a circle of trees older than any oak or pine he had ever laid eyes upon. There, the men dug feverishly into the ground. Barnes swore he saw them lift something heavy, wrapped in burlap, from the earth. The thing twitched, or perhaps the torchlight tricked his eyes. When the men noticed him, the next morning his farm was found deserted. The hearth still burning, livestock still penned, but Barnes himself gone without a trace. Word spread quickly, and fear deepened. Soon after, the Blackwood files began to circulate. No one knew who first leaked them, but pages of official documents, stamped with federal seals, were found stuffed into the cracks of barn walls and beneath church pews. The pages spoke of experiments, of anomalous children, and extra-human cognition. One report listed the triplets by name, noting incidents such as psychic projection, animal control, and even precognitive utterances. The most chilling entry simply read, "Subject status, missing, but not presumed dead." That line alone was enough to keep families awake for nights on end. The forest became a forbidden place. Hunters swore they saw shapes darting between the trees, small, fast, childlike. Women hanging laundry at dusk reported faint laughter on the wind. The laughter always came in threes. Then came the discovery. In June of that year, a group of railway workers cutting a new line through the hills stumbled upon an underground chamber, its entrance hidden beneath tangled roots. Inside were carvings. Not English, not any language the workers recognized. The walls were etched with symbols of 3 circles overlapping at the center. At the chamber's heart lay a stone basin filled with stagnant water, and within it 3 wooden dolls, bound together with twine. The dolls' faces had been carved crudely, but each bore a striking resemblance to the missing boys. The workers fled, abandoning their tools, refusing to return. When the sheriff's men came the next morning, the chamber was empty. The dolls were gone. That night, 3 houses burned on the edge of town. No one survived. The government agents called it coincidence. The ministers called it judgment. But in the quiet of their homes, the people of Cedar Mills admitted the truth no one wanted to say aloud. The boys were not lost, and they were not dead. They were becoming something else. By autumn, the town lived under constant dread. Dogs barked at nothing. Crops blackened overnight, and every so often, a child would wake screaming from dreams of 3 pale faces watching from the window. The forest no longer waited for people to enter. It had begun reaching out. By the winter of 1875, Cedar Mills was a ghost of itself. Half the homes stood abandoned, their doors swinging open to the wind. The fields lay fallow, livestock left to wander until they starved. The only sound at night was the bell of the old chapel, which tolled on its own, always in threes. It was then that Reverend Alcott, desperate to save what remained of his flock, declared a final act of cleansing. "The forest holds them," he told the gathered survivors, his voice quaking, "and to the forest we must return them." Armed with torches and scripture, nearly 30 townspeople followed him into Blackwood's heart. The deeper they went, the stranger the air became. Frost clung to the trees, though the ground was dry. Every so often, someone would hear footsteps just behind them, but when they turned, no one was there. The group pressed on until they found the clearing Ezekiel Barnes had once described. There, in the center, stood 3 figures, children, or what was left of them. The triplets' bodies had not aged. Their faces were pale, eyes black as pitch, each mouth moving soundlessly, as if speaking words the human ear could not hear. The crowd froze, too terrified to advance, too horrified to retreat. Then one of the boys raised his hand. The torches went out. Panic erupted. In the darkness came screams, horrible, tearing screams, as people vanished one by one. Some claimed to feel hands clutching their throats, others swore invisible claws raked across their backs. When the survivors stumbled out at dawn, fewer than half remained. Reverend Alcott was not among them. Those who returned brought a story no one wanted to believe. They spoke of the boys speaking as one, their voices echoing inside the skull, promising that the line will not end. That spring, 3 infants were born in Cedar Mills, each in a different household, each on the same night, each with the same birthmark, 3 circles overlapping at the wrist. The parents swore their children were normal, but the town knew better. The curse had not ended. It had only begun again. Time passed, as it always does, and the story of Cedar Mills was buried under newer tragedies, newer wars, newer inventions. By the 1890s, the once bustling Ohio town was little more than a scattering of rotting houses and moss-choked barns. The railway that had once promised prosperity bypassed it altogether. Travelers crossing the hills spoke only of a silence too heavy for any ordinary place, but silence has a way of carrying echoes. The last survivors of that generation left behind diaries, journals, and letters. Some were written in hurried scrawls, others in careful, trembling script. Again and again, one phrase appeared: "They are still here." Stranger still were the reports from outsiders. Railwaymen claimed they heard children laughing in the woods late at night, though no children lived within miles. A traveling salesman once told of seeing 3 boys standing in the shallows of the Ohio River, their faces blank, their bodies motionless, until they simply sank beneath the surface. He never returned to the area again. By the turn of the century, the name Cedar Mills had been quietly erased from most maps. But the government files, the ones locals called the Blackwood papers, never truly vanished. Sealed under official stamp, they occasionally surfaced in forgotten archives or dusty courthouse basements. And inside, the reports grew stranger. One memo, dated 1888, described secondary manifestations. Children across 3 different states, all born with the same overlapping circle mark. Some were described as gifted with unusual foresight, others as prone to violent outbursts or uncanny silences. The memo's final line read simply, "Containment remains unsuccessful," and then the trail ended, or perhaps it was made to end. Today, if you drive the back roads of southern Ohio, you may pass through a stretch of land where the trees grow too close together and the air feels heavier than it should. Locals will warn you not to stop. They'll tell you it's just old superstition. But if you do stop, if you step past the tree line into the shadows of what was once Blackwood Forest, you might feel it. The hum beneath your feet, the stillness pressing against your chest. And sometimes, if you linger long enough, you may hear it. Not 1 laugh, but 3. Science has no answer for what happened in Cedar Mills. Faith offers no comfort. The records that remain are fragments, riddles, and contradictions. Were the triplets victims of something older than the town itself? Were they born cursed or chosen? Or was it the people who brought the darkness upon themselves through fear, through cruelty, through obsession? No one can say for certain. But the story does not rest. It surfaces again and again, in whispers, in documents, in marks found on the wrists of children born 100 miles away. The triplets are gone. And yet, in some way, they are not. The only truth left is the one no one dares to face aloud. Some mysteries do not fade, they wait, and they always come back in 3s.